Hello. Today we're going over all three weekly matchup graphs. It is just the first 2 weeks, so I'll point it out if it is a little off, and I'll talk about last year's rankings too. But it'll be quarterback, running back, and receiver. Starting off with quarterback, one of my favorite guys from the week, maybe my second quarterback overall for the week, and that's Joe Burrow. He is fourth in volume, quarterback 14 right now overall, mainly because he's had 3 touchdowns that should have been touchdowns, and they've been called back, fumbled right before going in, etc. But now he gets the Commanders. They were 32nd against passing last year. They're 32nd this year. They're not good. And then you got the Bengals. They're 1-9 in Burrow's career in the first 2 weeks. Week 3, he's undefeated. I don't think it's fully a coincidence because the coaching is the main thing that I've noticed is they're just so inconsistent, especially at the start of the year. And then they start to go more and more into depth. We even saw it in week 2 in a bigger game, just the jump from week 1 to week 2. Didn't win the game. But week 3 in this get right spot, I think it's going to be a huge day for Burrow. But my number one guy, still going to be Josh Allen. I talked about in the deep notes, this Jacksonville defense is just perfect for him and most quarterbacks. They're horrible in man coverage and they run it a ton. I don't know why, like I said in the deep notes video, but it's perfect for fantasy quarterbacks, perfect for fantasy scoring. Man defense in general is better for quarterbacks. And then they have a rushing quarterback on the other side that scrambles, gets his design runs. That's amazing. When you have your back turned in man coverage, Josh Allen can just take off. Should be a huge day for him in fantasy, maybe a rushing touchdown if he gets some rushing opportunities on the goal line as well. So that'll be huge. Another guy that I want to talk about is Purdy. Right here, he is 32nd in projected volume, out of 32 obviously. But he's actually been 9th in volume this year. He is usually bottom 5 in volume consistently just because CMC and everything else, low passing volume offense overall. But he has been 9th these past couple of weeks. Part of that is Jordan Mason. The main problem, matchup is great, but he doesn't have his weapons. So Debo's out, Kittle going to be out, CMC out. So he has a higher ceiling because of the matchup. We saw Kyler torch this Rams defense last week. They haven't been good in recent history in passing defense. So he has a high ceiling, but it is still risky just because the volume and the weapons aren't there. Next guy I want to talk about is Derek Carr. Right next to him in that lower floor, higher ceiling area. The volume is low, but recently the efficiency has been insane. They've been first in play action. They've been top 5 in motion. This whole offense in general has been incredible just watching the difference from the past couple years. Kubiak, when you're looking at the offensive play calling in the EPA and explosive plays, all time, or at least the last 10 years, I think, he is number 1 in explosive play rate. It is a sample size of 2 games, but still, number 1. Like, it's really explosive offense, and then he's playing a Philadelphia defense that is bottom 5 against explosive passes, just going back to last year and this year. So young corners there, they were 32nd against receivers last year. They're still not amazing this year. 6.3 points per game against the outside receivers. So Shaheed, Olave, I'll talk about them later. That's the strength of this offense, and it's the weakness of the defense going back to last year. So I think it could be a big day for Carr again in a matchup that maybe is a closer game, more of a shootout too. Lawrence over on this left side. I don't love it. Monday night, Josh Allen on the other side. The pass rate has been weird. When we've looked in the past, especially when Doug Peterson has been calling plays, their pass rate is good, like they are a passing offense. Now they have this new play caller coming in, and they're running it way more than normal, which is just weird given that their offensive line isn't good. And ETN, great running back, but he is more of like that, not gadget guy, but receiving back, less volume, like you don't expect him to get 20 carries a game. And they're second in neutral passing rate, second to last in neutral passing rate, second in running. So that's been weird in terms of his volume. And then you talk about going into Buffalo. That defense, it's not really ideal this week for Trevor Lawrence. Daniels in a similar spot Monday night on the road in Cincinnati. He plays against the Bengals defense where it's a complex defensive coordinator in terms of play calling. And then on the other side, you got Kingsbury, who is the exact opposite. So for a rookie quarterback going into primetime on the road with that situation, I don't have confidence in the passing game. So he's very rushing dependent this week. Rushing is a little harder to guess. They are kind of middle of the pack in terms of man coverage, zone coverage, so it's harder to predict that way too in terms of scrambles. So he's just going to be more of, can he get his rushing? If he does, obviously a great play. If he doesn't, it could be very much a floor week for Daniels. And then very similar Close to that same area is Richardson, right below him, against a Chicago defense that is extremely good against the pass. Richardson hasn't been great in terms of the passing game so far this year. He had a ceiling game week 1, floor game in week 2. The rushing is, again, very dependent, similar to Daniels. Chicago is a very zone-heavy defense. Top 5 in zone coverage, so he's rushing dependent, and it's going to be less scramble. So it's one of those, can they have a good offense this week compared to last week when they were horrible? And maybe a couple goal line opportunities for Richardson. Very boom bust this week. And lastly, I want to talk about, I mentioned, this is 2 weeks. Some of it isn't really accurate. The perfect example for quarterbacks is Stroud. Vikings, they're solid against the pass. Last year, they were dead average, like 15th, 16th. But this year, they've played Purdy, which is okay, without a couple of his weapons. And then they played Daniel Jones. So they're third, but it's also like they're closer to last year when they were actually average. So the positive for Stroud, he is the best middle of the field passer in the NFL. It's not even close. Like, including guys like Mahomes, Josh Allen, Burrow, Herbert, whoever you want to say, he is number 1 in middle of the field passing since he has entered the league. And the Vikings, middle of the field open, 6th highest percent. So it works well for him. They're very high blitz. I think Stroud is perfectly fine when he's playing against the blitz. And Joe Mixon is a little banged up. So I think he's actually set up well. In running backs now, again, going from right to left. Henry against Dallas. They are 32nd, mainly because of Alvin Kamara. But they have kind of been smoked on the ground so far. So it's overall a good matchup. Although they had a good defense last year, they weren't incredible against the run, mainly in yards before contact. So the Ravens offensive line isn't as elite as it's been the last couple of years. It's pretty, I would say, below average even this season. But their yards before contact is still top 5, mainly because of Lamar Jackson. He basically serves as that extra blocker in the run game, like I like to say. Derrick Henry, against this Cowboys defense, they're 27th in yards before contact. So that's where he has the big advantage, especially if you can get him in ahead of steam. A couple goal line carries, he could pay off in a big way. Dallas' defense hasn't been ideal so far this season. So hesitantly confident in Derrick Henry. Mason has the volume. He's going to get the rushing volume, especially this week, just because they don't have any of their receivers, don't have any of their playmakers. Hopefully that means a couple more targets because he does have good volume here, but also it would be a lot higher in terms of just looking at touches, but he doesn't get the targets so far. Decent matchup against the Rams. Walker's down here just because his volume is so low because of the injury. I don't think he's going to play. If this was Charbonnet would basically be exactly where Mason is. So just keep that in mind. The next 2 guys I want to talk about is Jacobs and Stevenson. And you're probably watching this, or you are, because I'm filming this after the Thursday Night Football game, and thinking Stevenson's in the green and he got 0.3 points. If I could say this before the actual matchup, I promise I would say the exact same thing that I'm about to say about Jacobs. They're not really in the green. One, again, it's been 2 weeks. So they're going against really tough defenses. Jets, great defense. Titans, really strong on the ground. Amazing last year on the ground. Both of them don't really have good quarterback play, and neither are really favored. So if Malik Willis plays, that's kind of my same thought for Josh Jacobs this week. He was amazing last week against a bad Colts defense, 150 yards, and he had 13 fantasy points. So it's that same thing where it's like low touchdown upside, low receiving. It's not going to be a high floor, high ceiling game for Jacobs. Very similar to how it was with Stevenson last night. Both will have better days in the future. And speaking of that Colts defense, Swift, down here, that low floor, high ceiling, and that kind of matches perfectly. The Colts are closer to 32nd than 20th. In terms of an actual rushing, like if you looked at EPA per play or DVOA, like those more advanced stats compared to just like fantasy points in terms of rushing, they would probably be dead last, I'm sure. They have, for their last 2 weeks, have played 2 games, obviously. They have allowed 30 carries to both running backs, Joe Mixon and Josh Jacobs, and 150 rushing yards to both running backs. That is insane. The Bears are not going to run Swift 30 times. I guarantee it. They're probably not even going to run him 15 times with how Waldron runs his offense. But the Colts cannot stop anybody on the ground. He has a lot of rushing upside. Still some receiving there. If Caleb Williams has a little better day, maybe they get a couple touchdowns. Swift gets one of them. If he doesn't do well this week, I would start to panic. I already am. I don't love Swift, but this is kind of like that amazing matchup for him this week. On the opposite side of that, Jonathan Taylor. Very much boom bust, like he is basically every single week now. The receiving isn't really going to be there, and this matchup just isn't really made for him. Chicago wasn't good against running backs last year. They're kind of middle of the pack right now through 2 games. Last year, they were bottom 10, but that is because they were dead last against receiving running backs by a mile, and then they were good against rushing running backs. So they're 32nd against receiving. They were 5th versus rushing running backs last year. So not the most ideal matchup for him. It is probably going to be a closer game because Caleb Williams has been struggling on the other side. Hopefully Anthony Richardson gets it together, but their passing offense hasn't been good. I don't know how many opportunities he's going to get. So you're hoping to get like 15 to 20 and he falls in the end zone, gets like 70 yards rushing. That's like the hope. Still a start, I would say, but I don't think it's the most amazing matchup for him specifically. And we get to Achane right above him. Achane and Williams, these next 2 guys I want to talk about. His volume right now is 5th. When I first did this 2 weeks ago, his projected volume for week 1, I believe was 21st. And now he is 5th, 2 weeks later. Raheem Mostert's out. Wilson's banged up. I would expect Wright to get closer to 10 touches this week, double it, maybe more, just depending on how Achane's looking. Thompson is going to start, most likely. That isn't ideal, but I think the volume makes up for that situation in terms of the running game. Seattle, solid against running backs, but nothing to be too afraid of. And then you got Williams. Similar situation. San Francisco, 3rd against the rush. 26th against receiving running backs, which is important for Williams this week because they don't have Puka and they don't have Kupp. And like I talked about, going back to that Deep Notes video on TikTok, when Kupp is out, Kyren gets the targets and the routes. 57 routes so far this year because the receivers have been out. Barkley's at 48. That is the 2nd best. 9 more routes. And it's just been 2 weeks. He already has 9 more routes than anybody. 5.5 targets. A target is worth about 2.7 points in fantasy. So he's getting about 5.5 targets per game without Kupp. San Francisco isn't ideal against the passing. And we see that when we're looking at the history. So we go back to last year. He played 1 game against San Francisco. 14 carries and 52 rushing yards. No touchdowns. That isn't good. 5 points. But then you look at the receiving. 10 targets, 6 receptions, 48 yards, and a touchdown. That's 17 points. So his 5 points in rushing turns into 22 points overall. That's why I think he's fine as a start, especially like you drafted him in the 2nd round. It's not like he's one of those guys where he's your usual fringe flex play and he's going against San Francisco, tough matchup, you bench him. I think he's still fine just because the volume is going to be great, especially without Kupp and without Puka. Dobbins in this bottom left, it is one of those low floor, low ceiling just because, again, these are compared to themselves. So what he has had this week should be lower floor and lower ceiling. The Pittsburgh matchup, they play slow and they play like the Chargers. So I kind of picture how it being in week 1. Like Bijan had a solid day overall, still only 16 fantasy points despite great volume. And then he goes into Pittsburgh and the Chargers, and they're very similar. I'd expect closer to like that 15 to 10 game. Herbert is now questionable. That doesn't help. So last week he had about 20 carries, but that's because the Chargers ran it like 45 times. So not the greatest matchup. He's very touchdown dependent this week. If he doesn't score, I don't think it's going to be a good day for Dobbins. And I know that's pretty obvious to say, but more so for Dobbins. And lastly, just like Stroud, we see Barkley all the way on the left here. He's not all the way on the left. We look like Saints defense is fine. They're fine. Last year, they were below average, barely, against rushing running backs. So they're about average. But this year, who have they played? They played the Cowboys and the Panthers. Probably the 2 worst running back rooms in the league. So I'm not really worried about Barkley at all. Volume is obviously amazing. As I'll always do, starting off with the shadows for this week, it is tougher for receivers when it's only 2 weeks because it is just a lot more variable. There isn't many shadows. Jefferson, that is going to be a tough one with Stingley. Stingley's a really good corner, but it's also Justin Jefferson. So temper expectations, but obviously you're not benching Justin Jefferson. The one that I'm more worried about is Mike Evans. He's got Surtain. That is not ideal. Denver is already first against receivers. So Mike Evans is a very shaky start, especially when you're just thinking about like looking at Denver's last 2 games. Their offense has been so horrible. Neither quarterback on the other side. Like I know it was Fields, but like even Geno Smith had like 160 passing yards. It's just not the best ideal matchup for Mike Evans. Even Godwin to an extent, but also Baker Mayfield for sure. Other shadows. Cooper has Banks. That's fine. Nothing crazy. Wilson, Gonzalez last night. Insanely hard matchups through 4 weeks. He's going to have Surtain next week, but still completely confident in Garrett Wilson. Addison shadowed on the other side, but nothing crazy there. And that's all. Just those 5 guys this week. A lot of the other guys, the guys that normally do shadow, aren't really playing receivers that are worthy of being shadowed. Going into the non-shadows, Chase, again, I'll emphasize it. Weeks 1 and 2. Last year, for example, 30 yards week 1, 30 yards week 2, 140 yards in week 3. Like, it's not a coincidence, especially after last week, like another low volume day. He's frustrated. He's playing Washington, the most perfect matchup in the world. Out of the bottom 10 corners in the NFL right now in fantasy points per snap, 2 of them are the 2 primary corners against Jamar Chase this week. If he doesn't do well, I would actually be shocked. He is my number 1 receiver this week. I saw he was also Matthew Berry's, and I'm like, yep, that makes sense. So number 1 receiver, Jamar Chase, should have a lot of volume and should be an incredible matchup for him. Olave and Shaheed, I also mentioned it. Susceptible to those big plays. And Carr's been great at it. The Saints in general have been great at it. The targets and the volume haven't been there, but also you look at their games, it's kind of been 2 blowouts. So last week, they had 10 targets combined. Shaheed and Olave, 6 and 4. However, that equaled 67% of the target share. So in terms of a game where it's closer, maybe more opportunities, that target share could equal a lot more targets. So that's why I think their ceiling this week is just a lot better if it's a closer game. Marv, another great matchup. He gets Washington next week. Detroit this week. Detroit, 29th last year. They haven't been good so far this year. I think he continues where he left off last week. I think it could be a huge day for him. I really, really like Ayuk this week, especially now that Kittle's out. I talked about it in my last YouTube video, but San Francisco's volume is the most valuable volume in the NFL because they're so efficient and they have lower volume overall. So when you add 1 target, it's more than just that like couple extra fantasy points because Debo is top 5 in fantasy points per target. Ayuk, top 5 in fantasy points per target. Kittle, among tight ends, first in fantasy points per target. So when you take out Kittle, you take out CMC, you take out Debo, you have Ayuk getting all of that volume. Last year, he was wide receiver 16 on 7 targets per game. So if he gets 10 targets per game, that's when you have that top 5 upside. The matchup is okay. Nothing too hard, nothing too incredible. Actually, I would say, yeah, I'm thinking wrong because they got the Rams. They got torched by Marv last week. They got torched by J-Mo the week before that. So it's actually a great matchup for Ayuk in general. The next guy, love him as well, Devontae Smith, still a wide receiver 1 week in, week out with A.J. Brown out. I think even with A.J., he has wide receiver 1 upside, but he's going to be in the slot, and there's a couple guys I'll talk about that are in the same situation. He's playing against, who are they playing against? The Saints. Yeah. And same as the Falcons last week, really good against outside guys, not so great against the inside. They were 4th last year in outside corners, 28th against the slot. So Devontae, going to be in the slot 60 to 70% of the time. He should have a really great matchup, especially the volume that he could get without A.J. Brown. Neighbors, great volume. We saw it last week. At the same time, it's the Browns defense. We saw Brian Thomas Jr. struggle with it last week. He's going to have Emerson and Ward on him. About 90% of the time, it's going to be one of those 2 guys. So it's not the most ideal. I don't trust Daniel Jones. So it's a matchup like that where the Browns offense isn't anything crazy. The Giants offense isn't the best against really good outside corners. Could be one of those lower floor days for Malik Neighbors. Deontay Johnson, I get a question about it every single day. He's broken my heart so far, but I still have confidence in him. He's not a must start, but it's one of those situations where if you don't really have a guy that's like you're confident in, I'm fine with starting Deontay Johnson this week because of Andy Dalton. Dalton is one of those quarterbacks in the NFL right now that is a better fantasy quarterback than he is an NFL quarterback, especially when you have the Carolina defense on the other side. This is kind of what I was hoping for at the start of the season with Bryce, was having a Dalton-like year last year. So Dalton played 1 game last season. He had 58 passing attempts, 360 yards, high floor or high ceiling, low floor type of day. But we even look at how Dalton was last year. Thielen had like 30 points in his 1 start. DJ Chark had 20 in the 1 start. So like the receivers on that team got 50 fantasy points, just from having Andy Dalton in that one game, 360 passing yards. So I think it could be a really good day for Deontay, but it is just a risk because it's completely unknown. But overall, solid matchup. Michael Pittman next. No shadow, but Jalen Johnson is going to be on him about half the time. I haven't trusted him so far. I haven't trusted Richardson. This passing defense is really good. And Jalen Johnson, I'll say it again, most underrated corner in the NFL. Don't fully trust Pittman this week. Rice, similar to Devontae. I said another one of those guys. Same exact matchup as Atlanta, or as Devontae Smith had last week with Atlanta. Slot, they're 22nd. Outside, they're 3rd. So maybe not the best matchup for a guy like Worthy, but Rice in the slot, he's perfectly fine. I think he'll have another big day against this Atlanta team. London on the opposite side, I would say not the same. Jamar Chase last week, I would say it's similar. It's similar because they play a lot of too high. They play a lot of softer coverage. They don't want to give Chase over the top shots, and it's going to be similar with Drake London. Like that's especially, he wants to get downfield. The Chiefs want to stop that from happening. So what do they allow? They allow a lot of the under routes to the tight ends, a lot of the running backs, a lot of the shorter routes to the slot. So it could be a bigger day for Kyle Pitts, but Drake London, it's not the most ideal matchup. He's had some tough starts to the year just with the matchups he's had, similar to like a Garrett Wilson or even Jamar Chase. I don't think it'll be the best day for him. I would still consider starting him, but not the most ideal matchup in terms of the scheme. Miami, lastly, JSN, much better matchup than DK Metcalf. DK is going to have Ramsey on him for a good majority of the time. JSN on the other side had 16 targets last week. I think it's going to be very similar, just funneling that team because he's in the same situation as Devontae Smith, as Rashee Rice. Miami, really good on the outside, but when you get into the slot, they're not nearly as good. Geno has proved himself. He has looked amazing so far this year. The one problem is if Thompson does start, I don't know how close of a game it's going to be. So that's a problem, especially when JSN is more of that volume receiver, especially as a slot guy. But overall, pretty solid matchup.